The house was quiet that Saturday afternoon. Outside, the sun was still battling the clouds, but it didn't stop the Clark family from gathering for lunch. Megan, their daughter, sat at the table, absent-mindedly poking at her food. Now a young adult, her eyes were always curious, watching every little detail happening around her. Her mother, Carolyn, sat to her right, trying to keep the conversation going, yet she seemed distant, as if something inside her was breaking. In the background, down the hallway, Alan, the husband and father, moved slowly, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. At 50 years old, he found himself facing a reality he could no longer hide. What he thought was just a phase, a moment of uncertainty, had now become too heavy a burden to carry alone. He paused at the door of the dining room, watching his wife and daughter. The empty plate in front of Megan seemed like a reflection of the distance he felt. For so long, he had been the man everyone believed to be the pillar of the family, the perfect husband, the dedicated father. But the weight of the secret he had carried, like a stone in his chest, could no longer be ignored. "Carolyn, Megan," Alan said, his voice firm yet trembling. The immediate silence made his heart race. They looked up at him, not understanding the tone of his voice. He sat at the edge of the table, looking at the two women he loved more than anything, and then he began to speak. I need to tell you something I can't keep inside anymore. Something that, honestly, has been tormenting me." Carolyn stared at him intently, as if she had already sensed this wasn't going to be something trivial. Megan, on the other hand, seemed not to realize the gravity of the situation, her mind still somewhere else, more concerned with school and friends. But something in Alan's expression made her fall silent, her gaze now focused on him, trying to understand what he was about to reveal. "There's something I've been hiding for years." "Many years, actually," Alan began, swallowing hard. Carolyn leaned forward, her expression growing more surprised. I'm gay." The silence that followed was heavy, deep, and more than painful. Carolyn remained still, looking at him as if she couldn't understand what she had just heard. Megan, in turn, let out a nervous laugh as if she thought it was some kind of joke. But Alan wasn't smiling. He was serious, more serious than he had ever been in his entire life. "Is this true?" Carolyn asked, her voice shaky. "Alan, you're saying everything we had, everything we built, was a lie?" Alan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the pain in his wife's question. He knew she wasn't just questioning the truth of his words, but the very foundation of their life together. "No, it wasn't a lie. I loved you, and I still love you. But I'm also trying to be honest," finally he replied, his inner struggle visible in his expression. Megan seemed lost, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. She had seen her parents argue before, had witnessed moments of tension, but nothing compared to what was before her now. What did this mean for her life, for the future of their family? She didn't know what to think, didn't know what to do. She felt a mix of anger and confusion, trying to process the reality of a world that suddenly seemed to be crumbling around her. Carolyn remained silent for a few minutes. The anger in her heart fought against understanding. She wanted to be rational, but the pain of being kept in the dark for so long was rising with brutal force. "How could you hide this from me for so long?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Alan felt the weight of the question. He didn't know how he could have done things differently, but he knew the time wouldn't turn back. He had lived his life according to what he thought was right, according to society's expectations, but it had destroyed him from the inside out. I didn't know how to say it. I thought that if I followed what was expected of me, it would pass. But it didn't. I am who I am, and I can't live that way anymore. I betrayed you, Carolyn, by not being honest with you. Carolyn closed her eyes, trying to gather strength to process this. Her head spun, trying to find some point of balance, some logic that would make all of this make sense. But there was no logic in that moment, only pain. The pain of a life built on lies. The pain of a love that seemed to have been built on a false foundation. She looked at Megan, who still seemed stunned, unsure of what to do with the newfound information. Alan leaned back in his chair, trying to find the strength to continue, but the weight of the moment seemed to crush him. I need some time, Carolyn said finally, her words soft, almost inaudible. She stood up, leaving the table, and heading toward the kitchen door, where the sound of shattered glasses and utensils seemed to represent the fragility of her life at that moment. Megan didn't move, her eyes fixed on Alan, as if waiting for more explanation, but he didn't know what else to say. He had been honest, finally, but it seemed the impact of that truth was greater than either of them could have imagined. The house was silent again, but the weight of the revelation hung in the air, ready to change everything. The next few days were a blur for the Clark family. After Alan's confession, the house had become a place of tension, like a balloon on the verge of bursting. Carolyn had retreated into herself, barely speaking to him, and Megan, still processing her father's words, had become quieter than ever. It was as though the very fabric of their family had been torn apart, and no one knew how to stitch it back together. Alan spent most of his time in his office, staring out the window, trying to make sense of his decision. He had expected some sort of reaction, but he never imagined it would feel so devastating. His heart ached, and even though he had finally been honest, the weight of the truth seemed unbearable. He had wanted to live authentically, but the consequences of that desire were harder to bear than he had anticipated. Megan, on the other hand, had begun to withdraw further. She had always been a sensitive soul, and the shock of her father's revelation had struck her deeply. She had a million questions swirling in her head, but none of them had answers. She had been raised to believe in the idea of a family, one father, one mother, a daughter. But now everything was shattered. She was angry, confused, and unsure of what her place in this new world was. She had never seen her father as anything but a pillar of stability, and now that foundation had crumbled. The nights were the hardest. Carolyn would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She wanted to understand, to process everything. But every time she thought she had a grip on it, a new wave of anger and sadness would overwhelm her. Alan had apologized repeatedly, but the words felt hollow. How could she forgive him for something so monumental? How could she reconcile the man she thought she knew with this new version of him? One evening, after a long silence between the two of them, Carolyn broke down. "Alan, why? Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she asked, her voice cracking. She had been holding her emotions inside for so long that it was finally spilling out. "We could have worked through this together. We could have found a way to figure it out, but you kept this from me for so long. I don't know who you are anymore." Alan sat across from her, his heart breaking as he listened to the pain in her voice. He had always known that his secret would cause pain, but he hadn't realized just how deeply it would cut. He had hoped that, in time, they would find a way back to each other. But now, he wasn't sure if that was even possible. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting all of us. I thought if I just kept pretending, it would be easier. But it wasn't. I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted to lie to you." Carolyn shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But you did. You lied for years. You lied to me, to Megan, to yourself. Do you even know who you are, Alan? All these years I've been living with a man I thought I knew, and now I'm questioning everything. How am I supposed to trust you again?" Alan felt the weight of her words, and they hit him like a physical blow. He had never felt so lost in his own life. He had thought that coming out, telling the truth, would somehow make things easier. But it hadn't. It had torn them apart, and he didn't know how to fix it. The next day, after another awkward breakfast, Megan finally spoke up. She had been quiet for so long, trying to process everything in her own way, but now she needed answers. "Dad, why didn't you tell us sooner? Why now?" Megan asked, her voice low but firm. Alan looked at her, his heart sinking. She was the one person in the world who didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of all of this. But now she was, and he had no idea how to help her navigate it. "Megan, I wish I had the answers. I wish I could explain it to you better. But I didn't know how to tell you, how to tell your mother, how to tell myself. I've spent years running from who I am, and it's been a long and painful journey. But I can't run anymore. I can't hide anymore. This is who I am, and I'm sorry for not being honest with you sooner." Megan's eyes softened for a moment. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him, but she could see the pain in his eyes. She had always looked up to her father, and now she didn't know where to place him in her life. She didn't know if she could ever understand everything he had gone through, but she knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same again. Alan sat down on the couch beside her, feeling a sense of defeat wash over him. He had come out to them, hoping it would bring relief, but all it had done was unravel the life he had worked so hard to build. He wasn't sure if he could ever put things back together, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to give up on them. "I'm here for you, Megan. No matter what, I love you both. And I know it's going to take time, but I'm willing to wait. I just need you to understand that this is me. This is who I am." Megan nodded, her face still etched with confusion. She didn't know what to make of her father's words, but she knew this wasn't going to be an easy road. Carolyn, overhearing the conversation, stood in the doorway, her eyes full of sadness. She had heard everything, but her emotions were still too raw to join the conversation. She wanted to understand, but every step forward felt like an impossible climb. The days dragged on, and the tension in the house grew. Alan, trying to give his family space, withdrew even further. Megan continued to wrestle with her emotions, torn between anger and sadness, while Carolyn tried to find some semblance of peace in the chaos. But no one knew where to go from here. The weeks that followed seemed to stretch on endlessly for the Clark family. Each day felt like a test one that none of them were prepared for. It wasn't that they didn't want to heal. but the pain and confusion were overwhelming. Alan, Carolyn, and Megan all found themselves walking around in a daze, unsure of what would come next, unsure of how to move forward in the wake of Alan's revelation. Carolyn still couldn't shake the constant weight in her chest. She had tried to bury her emotions, to push past the hurt and anger, but they resurfaced every time she closed her eyes. She spent more time outside the house, at work, at the grocery store, visiting friends, just to avoid the tension that had become too much to bear. Alan noticed it, but didn't know how to reach her. His guilt kept him at a distance, afraid of making things worse. But then one Saturday afternoon, something shifted. It was an ordinary day, filled with mundane tasks, laundry, cleaning, the usual weekend chores, but as Alan was sitting in the living room, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. Carolyn was on the phone with her sister, Julie, and Alan wasn't supposed to be eavesdropping, but what he heard stopped him in his tracks. "I don't know what to do. Julie, Alan's gay, after all these years, and I'm just trying to figure out how to survive this. I don't even know if I can look at him the same way again. I don't know if I even want to." Caroline's voice cracked, and Alan felt his stomach drop. He had braced himself for anger, for disappointment, but hearing her say the words out loud, hearing the pain in her voice, was something entirely different. Alan could barely breathe, as though the walls of the house had closed in around him. Caroline's struggle was real. It wasn't just about accepting his truth. It was about accepting everything they had built together, everything that now felt like a lie. Julie's voice came through the line, softer, but filled with concern. "Carolyn, I know this is hard, but you can't carry this all alone. Talk to him. Let him explain. It might not be as bad as you think, but you have to hear him out." Alan could hear Caroline's frustrated sigh from across the room. "How can it not be bad, Julie? He's been lying to me for decades. We have a daughter. What kind of life were we living? I don't know if I can forgive him. I don't know if I want to." Alan's heart felt as though it was being crushed under the weight of her words. The woman he had loved for decades, his wife, the mother of his child, was unraveling before him, and he was powerless to stop it. He quietly stood up and walked away from the conversation, retreating to his office. He closed the door behind him, but the silence that followed was deafening. He needed to think, to gather his thoughts, but he couldn't stop hearing Caroline's voice. Laced with pain, it was like a knife to the heart. An hour later, Alan came out of his office, feeling the heavy weight of the moment. He found Caroline in the kitchen, standing by the counter, staring blankly at the sink. She didn't notice him at first, lost in her thoughts. But then, as if sensing his presence, she turned to face him. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and grief, and for the first time in weeks, Alan saw the depth of her hurt. "Carolyn." Alan's voice cracked, and he took a hesitant step forward. Carolyn didn't move. She didn't speak either. She simply stared at him, as though searching for something in his eyes that would explain everything. "I heard you on the phone." He spoke softly, barely above a whisper. For a long moment, Carolyn didn't respond. The tension between them was thick, suffocating. "You've heard it all already, Alan. What more do you want me to say?" She finally said, her voice flat. There was no anger in her words, just an overwhelming sadness, a hopelessness that Alan couldn't escape. "I want to apologize. I want to try and explain. I never wanted to hurt you, Caroline. I never wanted to make you question everything, but this is who I am. I can't change that." Her eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly, not wanting to break down in front of him. But she couldn't stop herself. The dam she had been holding back finally broke. I don't know how to go back, Alan. I don't know how to make sense of all of this. I thought I knew you. I thought we had a life, a family, and now I feel like everything was built on a lie." Alan's heart shattered at her words. He stepped forward, wanting to hold her, wanting to comfort her, but he stopped himself. He knew she wasn't ready for that. He wasn't sure if she ever would be. "I know this isn't easy, and I don't expect you to understand everything overnight, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I know I've hurt you, but I want to do whatever it takes to make things right. We don't have to have all the answers right now. I just need you to know that I'm still me. I'm still the man you married. I'm still your partner, but I'm also someone different now." Caroline stared at him for a long time, the silence hanging between them like a wall. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again, but I'm willing to try. I don't know what that looks like, but I don't want to throw everything away just because things are hard." Alan felt a spark of hope small. "But there, thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance. I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I just need you to know that I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The next few days were filled with uncertainty. Caroline's heart was still heavy, but there was a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Alan, too, was trying to find a way to rebuild the trust he had lost, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Megan, still grappling with her own emotions, stayed mostly out of the way, but she could sense the shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. Her father and mother weren't where they had been before, but they were trying. And so, amidst the tension and the uncertainty, the Clark family began the slow, painful journey of rebuilding. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift, slowly but noticeably. It wasn't that everything was fixed, it wasn't, but there was a change in the air, a subtle undercurrent of hope that hadn't been there before. Alan and Caroline had started to communicate more openly, and though their conversations were often strained, they were speaking. There was a tension, but it was different now. It wasn't the suffocating silence that had defined their lives after Alan's confession. It was a tentative kind of understanding. Caroline, still struggling with the feelings of betrayal, tried her best to keep things together for the sake of their daughter, Megan. They had always been a family, and she didn't want to shatter that just because their lives had taken an unexpected turn. But every day was a battle, trying to figure out what came next. How would their relationship look now? What did it even mean to rebuild trust? And could they still love each other in the same way? Caroline had never imagined that at 50. She'd be here questioning everything about her life, her marriage, her identity. She had always thought she knew who Alan was. They had been together since their 20s, built a life, a home, a family. They had weathered so many storms together. But this storm, this one felt different. Alan was no longer the man she had married. and she wasn't sure who he was now, or if she could even learn to love him in this new form. She had started seeing a therapist, hoping to sort out her feelings, but nothing felt certain. Everything felt like it was suspended in a state of limbo. As the days passed, Carolyn tried to push her emotions to the side during the day. When Megan came home from school, she would focus on her daughter, pretending things were normal. But at night, when the house grew quiet and the weight of everything settled in, Carolyn couldn't stop her mind from spinning. Alan, too, was struggling in his own way. He was filled with guilt, not just for the lies he had told, but for the hurt he had caused. He spent hours reflecting on his past, on the years he had spent trying to ignore his true self, trying to live up to expectations that weren't his. His guilt weighed heavily on him, but there was also a sense of freedom. The truth had come out, and while it had shaken everything he knew, it was also the beginning of something new. He just didn't know what that new reality would look like. Alan did everything he could to show Carolyn that he was still the man she had married, at his core. He took on more responsibilities around the house, worked to repair the things that had frayed between them over the years. But every time Carolyn looked at him, she couldn't help but feel like something was broken that couldn't be fixed. One evening after dinner, Caroline suggested they take a walk. The air was cool, crisp autumn had settled over the city, turning the streets a soft shade of orange and yellow. Alan, hesitant but willing to try anything to ease the tension, agreed. They walked in silence at first, neither of them knowing what to say. It was the first time in weeks they had been alone together, and yet the gap between them felt larger than ever. Carolyn broke the silence first, her voice low. "Alan, do you think we can ever go back to what we were before all of this?" Alan looked at her, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thing, fragile enough that he didn't want to shatter it with his words. "I don't know. I wish I could tell you yes, but I'm not sure. I can't undo the past. I can't change what I've done. But I can try, Caroline. I can work every day to make things better. If you'll let me." Her eyes softened just slightly, but it was enough for Alan to see the tiny glimmer of hope that had been absent before. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again, and I'm scared that everything is too far gone, that you've changed, and that I'm just not the woman you need anymore." Alan's heart sank. He didn't know how to make her understand. He had changed, yes, but the love he felt for her, for their life together, hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, buried beneath the confusion and the hurt, but it was there. "I'm still the man you married, Carolyn. I'm still the father of Megan. I haven't changed in the ways that matter. I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." They continued walking, their pace slow, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The world around them seemed to fade into the background as they processed the moment. "I don't know how to trust you again, Alan. I don't know if I can." Alan nodded, his voice soft. "I know, and I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but I am asking you to give me a chance, a real chance to prove that I'm still the man you married, that I'm still worthy of your love." There was a long silence between them. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't tense either. It was as if they both knew that they had started a journey, one that was uncertain, one that would require time, patience, and a lot of work. But at least they had started it together. When they reached home, Carolyn seemed a little different. There was no grand reconciliation, no promises of a perfect future, but there was a sense that they were beginning to find a way forward. It wasn't easy. It was far from easy, but it was something. Over the next few days, they continued their tentative steps toward rebuilding. Alan attended therapy, seeking help to navigate his new reality and his relationship with Carolyn. Carolyn, too, started to heal, though the process was slow. She wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but she was learning to live with the uncertainty, to accept that the life they had once known might never return. It was a long road ahead, but at least they had taken the first step. Neither of them knew what would come next, but for the first time in weeks, they were both willing to find out. The weeks after their walk had been filled with small steps, little victories and small defeats, all part of the long road to figuring out what their future would look like. Alan and Carolyn were learning to coexist, but it wasn't easy. The weight of the past still hung over them like a shadow, but with each passing day, they both seemed to be carrying it just a little bit less. Alan was trying hard to show Carolyn that he was committed to making things right, but it wasn't as simple as that. Every time he thought they were making progress, a stray comment, an old habit, or an unexpected flash of emotion would send them back to square one. Carolyn was still struggling with the fact that the man she had loved for so many years, her rock, her partner, had been hiding such a monumental part of himself. There were days when the weight of that betrayal felt too much to bear, and she wondered if she would ever be able to forgive him fully. Other times she found herself laughing with him, enjoying their conversations, and for a fleeting moment she would forget. But then the reality would settle back in. Megan, their daughter, was no stranger to the tension. She was a bright and perceptive 16-year-old, and while she didn't fully understand the dynamics of her parents' struggles, she could feel the shift in the air. She would catch her mother looking at her father with a sadness that was hard to miss. There were nights when Megan overheard quiet conversations between them, discussions that didn't make it past the threshold of their bedroom. She often wondered if her parents would ever be the same again. One evening, after dinner, Carolyn had just finished cleaning the dishes when Megan asked if they could talk. The tone of her voice made Carolyn pause, her hands still on the plate in front of her. Caroline hadn't realized how much time had passed since they'd last really talked. She dried her hands on the dish towel and sat down at the kitchen table, looking at her daughter. "Sure, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Megan sat across from her, her expression serious. It wasn't like her to be so quiet, especially not around Caroline. They had always been close, and Carolyn had prided herself on their strong mother-daughter bond. "Mom, is Dad really okay?" The question took Carolyn by surprise. She wasn't sure how to answer. Megan had always been perceptive, but this was different. This wasn't just a casual inquiry about Alan's well-being. It was a question about the state of their family, their home, everything that had felt solid just a few months ago. "He's trying, Meg. He really is, but, this is hard for both of us." Megan nodded slowly, her eyes scanning her mother's face. Carolyn could see the concern in her daughter's gaze, the way she was holding herself back, trying not to show how much she was affected by everything. Carolyn wanted to reassure her, but the truth was she didn't know how. "Mom, are you ever going to forgive him?" The question hit Carolyn like a punch in the gut. She hadn't expected it, not from Megan. The question was simple, but its weight was immense. Caroline took a deep breath, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, she didn't know. She was still trying to figure that out. "I'm trying, Meg, but it's not easy. It's going to take time. I don't know when or if I'll fully forgive him, but I'm doing my best to understand." Megan seemed to accept the answer for the moment, though Carolyn could see that there was more she wanted to ask. But instead she simply nodded and got up to leave the room. Carolyn sat there for a moment longer, her thoughts a tangled mess. Could she forgive Alan? Could she let go of the past and build something new with him? The thought felt both impossible and necessary. That night, as Caroline and Alan lay in bed, the silence between them felt more comfortable than it had in weeks. There were no grand declarations or passionate conversations. They simply existed in the same space, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what their relationship had become. Caroline, her voice, soft and tentative, broke the silence. "Yes, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Do you think we're ever going to be happy again? Or are we just surviving?" Caroline was quiet for a long time. The question wasn't one she had asked herself before. It was easier to pretend that they were slowly working through things, that they were going to be okay. But deep down, Caroline knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know, Alan. I really don't. But I'm trying. I'm trying for you, for me, and for Megan." Alan nodded. He understood. He had no answers either. But he was committed to this, committed to trying, even when it felt like he was walking a tightrope without a safety net. The next day, Caroline and Alan went out for lunch together. It was a quiet, almost ordinary moment. They sat at a small booth in a diner eating sandwiches and talking about inconsequential things, work, Megan's plans for the upcoming weekend, the weather. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were beginning to find a rhythm again, even if it was a fragile one. Alan had started to make small gestures of reassurance, sending Caroline little text messages during the day, telling her he was thinking of her, that he appreciated her. It wasn't grand, but it was something. He was trying to show her that he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere. He was still fighting for their marriage, even when it felt like the fight was a losing battle. Caroline, too, had begun to open up more. She wasn't ready to forgive Alan completely, but she was starting to see glimpses of the man she had married, the man who cared for her, who loved her in his own way. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As they finished their lunch and prepared to leave, Alan looked at Caroline with a hint of hope in his eyes. "Caroline, I'm not asking for everything right away. I know I have to prove myself, but can we keep going? Can we keep trying?" Caroline didn't answer right away. She took a moment, her eyes searching his face. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something that resembled trust. It wasn't all the way there, not yet, but it was a start. "We'll try, Alan, we'll try." The months had begun to settle into a rhythm. Caroline and Alan were still working through their struggles, and though the air between them was often thick with unsaid things, there was also a quiet understanding that they were doing their best. Megan, now more aware than ever of the delicate balance in their home, was taking her own steps toward understanding what all of this meant for her. Her relationship with her parents had shifted, but there were moments when the three of them still found joy together small. Fleeting moments, but moments nonetheless. One night, Alan came home late from work. He had been spending more time at the office lately, and Carolyn could feel the distance growing between them once again. It wasn't just the physical space. It was the emotional space that seemed to widen with every passing day. Alan's attempt to rebuild their marriage had been commendable, but Caroline couldn't help but feel like they were in a holding pattern, waiting for something to shift, for something to happen. As Alan entered the house that evening, he noticed the lights were dim, and Caroline was sitting on the couch, reading. Her book was open, but she wasn't really reading it. She was staring off into space, lost in thought. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her, but then he moved toward the couch and sat beside her. "Hey!" Caroline glanced at him, but didn't immediately respond. There was a weight to her silence that he couldn't ignore. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice distant. Alan could feel the tension between them, thick and unspoken. He had tried for months to close the distance, but there was always something there, something he didn't fully understand. He reached over and gently touched her hand, the contact soft and tentative. "It was fine. Busy, like usual. I thought about you today, though. About how we're doing." Caroline looked down at their hands, her mind racing. She had heard the words before, the reassurance, the promises, but something in her still couldn't fully trust that Alan was being honest. Not because of anything specific, but because of the years of silence before, the years of not knowing who he truly was, Alan. She began, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking about everything, about us." Alan waited for her to continue, his chest tightening as he braced for what was coming. He had spent so long trying to show her that he was committed to change, that he was committed to them. But he knew deep down that no matter how hard he tried, there were still things that needed to be said, things that were going to be difficult. "I'm tired, Alan. I'm really tired." Her words struck him like a punch. He had heard them before, but they felt different this time. They were heavy with emotion, with years of unresolved pain, disappointment, and confusion. Caroline's voice quivered, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness that came from holding everything together, from trying to keep their family intact despite the cracks that had started to form. "I know, Caroline, I know, but I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." Caroline shook her head, a small sigh escaping her lips. She wanted to believe him, but it was so hard. For so long, she had tried to make excuses for him, tried to rationalize his behavior, tried to see the man she had once known. But there was still a part of her that couldn't forgive, that couldn't move past the lies. "I don't think you fully understand how much it hurt. How much it still hurts, Alan." He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. It wasn't the first time she had said them, but tonight they felt different. Tonight they felt like the truth. "I do understand, Caroline. I understand more than you think." She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a moment she saw the man who had once been her partner, the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin. But there was something else there, too. Something that had changed. And it was that change, that shift in their relationship, that she wasn't sure how to navigate. "I need you to understand, Alan. I need you to understand that this isn't just about your secret. It's about everything. The years we spent pretending, the years I spent not knowing who you really were. I need to find a way to live with that. The silence that followed was thick. Alan could feel the ache in his chest, the guilt that had never fully left him. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that he understood, that he would do whatever it took to make things right. But even as the words formed in his mind, he knew that no matter what he said, there were no quick fixes, no easy answers. I know it's a lot. And I'm sorry, Carolyn, I don't expect things to be easy. But I want you to know that I am committed to us. I'm committed to trying every single day. Carolyn didn't answer immediately. She sat there staring at the wall, as if trying to process everything he had said. It wasn't that she didn't want to believe him, she did, but there was a part of her that was still afraid that she would never be able to fully let go of the past, afraid that, no matter how much they tried, things would never go back to the way they were. I don't know, Alan. I don't know if I can keep doing this. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain. Carolyn felt the truth of them deep in her bones. She didn't know. She didn't know if she could keep living in this in-between space, where everything was uncertain, where every gesture felt like an attempt to fix something that might be broken beyond repair. Alan sat silently, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't find the right words to say, couldn't figure out how to convince her that he was worth the risk, that they were worth the risk. But then, just as the silence seemed unbearable, Carolyn looked at him, her eyes softer now, her shoulders less tense. I don't know if we can fix this, Alan, but maybe we can try to live with it. The words weren't a promise, but they were a start. And for Alan, they were more than enough. They were all he needed to hear. As the weeks passed, a delicate truce seemed to settle over the family. Carolyn and Alan weren't in the clear yet, not by a long shot, but they had started to communicate better, and there were moments fleeting, but meaningful, where they could smile at each other without the weight of their past mistakes hanging heavily in the air. They were still navigating a new reality, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were doing it together. Megan, too, had adjusted. She was still processing everything, but she had stopped retreating into her shell. She had questions, so many questions, but she was beginning to see that her parents weren't just defined by the mistakes they had made. They were human, too, and humans made mistakes. Maybe this was a chance for them to rebuild, to become something different, something stronger. She wasn't sure what that looked like yet, but she was cautiously optimistic. One Saturday afternoon, as Carolyn and Alan sat in their living room, they heard a knock at the door. It was Megan, who had been spending more time with her friends lately. She was holding something in her hands, a folder of papers, and there was an intensity to her expression that immediately caught their attention. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you." Carolyn and Alan exchanged a glance, both feeling a sudden surge of anxiety. It wasn't like Megan to look so serious, so determined. They sat up straighter, waiting for her to explain. "What's going on, sweetie?" Alan asked, trying to sound casual, though he could feel the tension building. Megan didn't waste any time. She opened the folder, revealing a set of legal documents. Caroline's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar layout of an adoption petition. "What is this, Megan?" Carolyn asked, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and concern. Megan looked at both of them, her gaze steady, her resolve unwavering. "I've been thinking a lot about what you both have been going through, about everything that's happened, and I've decided. I want to help you both start over, to help us all start over." Carolyn and Alan sat in stunned silence as Megan continued. "I'm old enough to make my own decisions now. I'm legally changing my name. I'm going to adopt the name Wells, both of you. I want us to be a real family again, to have something new, something that can't be defined by what came before. This is my way of showing you that I want to be with you, no matter what." The room was quiet for a long time after Megan spoke. Alan and Carolyn looked at each other, their eyes wide with surprise. The decision Megan was making was monumental. It wasn't just about a name, it was about creating something new from the wreckage of their past. It was about starting over, not in the sense of erasing everything that had happened, but of accepting it, of moving beyond it. "Megan, I don't even know what to say. This is so much," Carolyn whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "Are you sure about this?" Megan nodded, her expression softening. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew that this was something she needed to do, something that felt right. She had come to understand that healing wasn't about pretending the past didn't exist. It was about building something from it, something stronger and more resilient. "Yes, I'm sure. I've thought about it a lot. I want to take the step forward. I want to leave behind the things that held us back." Alan stood up, walking over to Megan. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to do this for us, Megan. We love you. You're our family, no matter what." But Megan smiled, her eyes bright with something new, something like hope. "I know. I'm doing this for me, too. I need to do it for myself." The three of them stood together in the living room, in that small, quiet moment where the weight of the world seemed to lift just a little. For the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they were drowning in their past mistakes. They felt like they had a chance to rebuild, to reframe their lives in a way that worked for all of them. Alan turned to Carolyn, his expression full of gratitude and love. "I don't know what the future holds, Carolyn, but I do know one thing. I don't want to go through it without you." Caroline took a deep breath, her heart swelling with a tenderness she hadn't felt in so long. "I don't want to go through it without you, either." And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. They didn't know exactly what it would look like, but they knew they would face it together. No longer weighed down by secrets or lies, they had a chance to build something new, not just for themselves, but for Megan, too. Megan smiled, a quiet but resolute expression on her face. She didn't know exactly what the future held either, but in that moment she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real.